representation to the EU. The webinar is the latest in a series of webinars that we've been running focusing on EU jobs. And today we're going to look at EU job opportunities in the agriculture and rural development domain. Previously in this series, we've looked at a number of other possibilities. For example, the option of traineeships. We've looked at the lawyer, linguist and proofreader roles. We've looked at women in EU jobs. But today, as I say, we're going to look at agriculture and rural development. Here at the representation, we're always interested to connect with those who are interested in EU jobs, and we're constantly trying to upgrade and rethink how we provide you services in that regard, how we assist you in that domain. And that's really what today is about. Clearly, given developments over recent years, it's more and more important that Ireland is very linked into the EU. And we have as a major priority at the moment the desire to expand our footprint across the EU institutions to make sure that as many Irish people as possible are working for the EU. Today's competition that has motivated the event today is a competition looking for specialists in sustainable agriculture and rural development. And we'll say more about that competition being run by EPSO, the European Personnel Selection Office, with a deadline of the 9th of March. So our timing is very much intended to chime with that competition. Here at the Permanent Representation, we offer a range of supports to you in your efforts to look for and secure EU jobs. Those supports are every step of the way, whether it's with computer-based training or even one-to-one assistance at later stages in competitions. Currently, the government is developing an EU job strategy where we're seeking to amplify those supports and add new aspects. But we're already doing a lot, and this series is very much part of those endeavours. If you'd like to get in touch with us, please email us at eujobs@dfa.ie. We've also got practical advice on our website. So we wish you the best of luck in your efforts to secure EU jobs, and we try to accompany you with practical endeavours like today. And that brings me to today. I'm delighted to welcome our guest speakers today. I'll introduce each of them in a moment, but first maybe I'll say a little bit about the format. We're going to begin with a presentation by Michael Scannell, who's the Deputy Director-General of the European Commission's Directorate-General for Agriculture and Rural Development. Then we're going to hear from Martin Crowley, who's a colleague of mine here at the representation who leads our agriculture team. And then we're going to hear from Pamela, who's going to talk to you about actually what it's like to be in a policy officer role. And we will therefore get an insight into the realities of the job that is currently being advertised. You can ask us questions by Slido, which is a very simple format. If you just Google Slido, sli.do, and enter the code EU jobs, we will be able to see your questions. And at the end of today's presentations and the conversation that I'm going to have with Pamela Boyle, we'll then turn to the Slido questions, and I will put them to the speakers on your behalf. Slido, as I say, is very simple. You don't have to sign up. Just Google it and follow the instructions. So look, let's maybe get started. And I'm going to turn first to Michael Scannell. Michael, as I say, is the Deputy Director-General of the Agriculture and Rural Development, DG Agri, in the European Commission. Michael has held that role since July of last year. And prior to that, he held a number of senior roles in both DG Agri and DG Sante, and indeed worked in 2 cabinets over the years. So he has vast experience of the EU, and in particular the policy area we're talking about today. We're delighted to have Michael with us. Michael is one of a very small group of Irish people at the level that he is at in the European Commission. So the floor is yours. Michael, over to you. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Eamon, and good afternoon to all the colleagues who are participating in this particular event. Obviously, I'm going to speak to you from the dimension of DG Agriculture and the concours competition, which we have just published. It's the first in a generation. For the past number of years, DG Agri has essentially been recruiting from so-called generalist concours, lawyers, economists, etc. But over time, this has led to a situation where we've lost a lot of true agriculture-related expertise. And this particular competition is expected to fill that gap and provide us with a pool of candidates that we can count on to bring real value added to the work of the DG over the next number of years. Now, I assume anybody listening in is interested in doing the concours and perhaps interested in working in the commission itself. So in a short 10-minute presentation, obviously, I can't go into too much depth, but I'll just give you a few, let's say, of the core concepts which I would expect any interested candidate to display if and when they come and work in DG Agri. And the first of those would be a good understanding of the core objective and role of DG Agri, which is food security, keeping our citizens fed. It's something that's tended to get overlooked in recent decades, but historically, all societies have faced a major challenge in keeping their citizens fed. And that led to a situation post-World War II in the emerging EU treaties, where a top priority was given to essentially ensuring that Europe managed to keep its citizens fed with safe, affordable food. And that concept was accompanied by a realization that to achieve that, you need basically a profitable farming sector, i.e. farmers who can make a viable living, and in tandem, a viable rural infrastructure. Because unless, for example, farmers are living in a society where their kids can go to good schools, where they have access to medical services, and the basic social infrastructure that most citizens take for granted, well, it's not going to be particularly attractive for them. And that's a reality in today's Europe. A lot of rural societies and rural areas are in structural decline for exactly those types of reasons. And DG Agri has a core role and objective to basically ensure that farmers can operate profitably, efficiently, to keep our societies fed. We've had a very sharp reminder in the context of the current COVID crisis that essentially agriculture proved very resilient. We didn't see any major disruption in the food supply chain, either in terms of prices to consumers or the prices received by producers. And that's a tribute to the CAP itself. But we want to ensure that that situation continues into the future. So if someday you arrive working in DG Agri, I'd expect you to be able to give me good reasons why this remains a perfectly good and valid objective. Another of the core concepts underlying the work of the DG is sustainability. Of course, this is on everybody's lips these days in the context of climate change. You should already be familiar with the Green Deal, and especially from the agricultural perspective, the accompanying farm-to-fork communication. And this is essentially the Commission's strategy to ensure that agriculture becomes more sustainable into the future, because agriculture is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, but in turn, it's also potentially a huge victim of climate change. If, for example, we see recurrent major climatic events, droughts, flooding, etc., that obviously impacts on agricultural productivity. So there's a carrot and stick dimension to all this. But bottom line, our farmers, our agricultural production systems need to become much more sustainable. So we have to aim for lower usage of pesticides, antibiotics, fertilizers, bigger investment in organics, etc., to basically ensure that our impact on the environment is mitigated. An important dimension in that context also is that sustainability is not just about environmental sustainability. It also includes economic and social sustainability. So unless farmers continue to be able to operate efficiently, effectively, and profitably, well, then they won't be sustainable. And in turn, our agricultural systems will not be sustainable. So this is not, let's say, a one-dimensional issue. It has to embrace, as I say, these wider dimensions of sustainability, something that's often lost in the current context where the focus tends to be overwhelmingly on the environmental dimension. Another component, the trade dimension, and this relates to both trade within the European Union itself, of particular interest to Ireland for very obvious reasons. We have a huge agri-food sector, but also trade with third countries. And this is a very important economic dimension, a political dimension, indeed a development dimension. As an example, a lot of developing countries, they're really only competitive in relation to agricultural and food products. So in any trade negotiation, in any development negotiation, they look for market access to the EU. But we have to work with our colleagues elsewhere in the Commission to ensure that access doesn't undermine our own agri-food production systems. And I'm not just speaking in terms of competitiveness here, but in terms of safety standards, environmental standards, etc. But this often brings us into conflict in, for example, the WTO and in trade negotiations with third countries. And I only mentioned Mercosur in that context because in the view of some, we've got that balance wrong. But as I say, I just highlight that it's important for these countries. They won't enter into trade negotiations with the EU unless they see basically benefits and pluses for themselves. So in essence, we have to be prepared to negotiate with them to arrive at a fair and reasonable balance that gives them access to our markets, but without undermining our own systems themselves. There's a very important economic dimension. Agriculture tends, you'll see the figures thrown around yourself, a very small share of the economy, including in Ireland. However, that often overlooks the much wider dimension to the agri-food chain. Essentially, the produce of our farmers only accounts for a quarter or so of the total value added in the agri-food chain, which includes, for example, the food manufacturers, the distributors, the retailers, etc. But that quarter is extremely important because that's the raw material for all these other sectors to basically process, sell, export, trade, etc., etc. So essentially, without the basic agricultural production dimension, the rest, frankly, doesn't have a role. So we have to continually remind our colleagues in other commission services and indeed member states to keep this wider dimension of agriculture in mind. It has impacts, for example, on the pharmaceutical industry, all the inputs that go into agriculture, all the logistics in terms of transport, storage, etc., etc. So in reality, the impact of agriculture is much bigger than the crude raw material figures suggest. And a very important dimension in that context also is the sensitivity of agriculture. All citizens relate to agriculture because they eat more or less 3 times a day. And they can relate. They might not understand WTO rules on intellectual property rights or competition rules, but they all understand or think they understand food and how it's produced, traded, etc., etc. So anything that touches on our agri-food production systems tends to be extremely politically sensitive. And if you look at our wider trade negotiations with third countries at EU level, you'll often find that the agriculture dimension is the most sensitive because, as I say, a lot of citizens make their overall judgment on whether we should or should not enter into these negotiations on this particular agri-food dimension. Another aspect, and I think this captures everything that I've said previously, because it's where in practice implementation is key, how we ensure that all these issues on food security, the trade dimension, the economic dimension, the sustainability dimension feeds through into our agri-food policies, is the CAP itself, the Common Agricultural Policy, because this is the policy instrument, the legislative framework that allows us to identify our objectives, how we attain them, including the funding that we target at them. And the CAP is now currently undergoing a major review. This is part of what we know or call in the Commission the multi-annual financial framework. The EU works in programming cycles, normally over 7 years. And that MFF, as it's called, has now been agreed. But the agricultural dimension of it is still under negotiation, and it's to apply from 2021 to 2027 with a 2-year transition period for the CAP itself. And as I speak, we're engaged in negotiations with the European Parliament and the member states on that CAP infrastructure. And that will essentially shape policy over the next several years and provide the answers to all those who ask, well, how can you ensure that the CAP is sustainable? How can you ensure that it guarantees food security for our citizens? How does it address the issue of farmers' incomes and rural infrastructure, etc.? The answers to those questions you will find in the CAP as it stands, and how it will be reformed to address our future objectives. So getting back to the issue of, for example, sustainability, the CAP will be fundamentally reorientated in a more sustainable direction. So all our funding instruments, and we're talking about 56 billion a year, will be essentially have a very important conditionality dimension, so that spending what farmers receive will very often be formally conditional on them meeting certain environmental and sustainability targets, etc., to ensure that essentially the food that we produce into the future has a lower carbon footprint. And all DG Agri officials follow these negotiations very closely, because the eventual outcome will essentially decide what they will be doing for the next several years or so. To conclude, just a few little points on essentially the working environment and what expected of you. Obviously, this is a specialist concours, so if you know nothing about agriculture, don't waste your time applying. You really need to have a very good knowledge and understanding. Most of that is set out in the notice itself for the competition, which gives you, let's say, the broad bones of what's expected of you. But what we're looking for in particular, aside from knowledge and experience of agriculture-related issues, is basically people who are hardworking, innovative, who see the bigger picture. So if you want to do the same job for the next 35 years, this is not the job for you. And I'd emphasize in that context, just because you come and work for DG Agri doesn't mean you're married to DG Agri. Mobility in the Commission is very easy if you're interested. I myself have served in several different Commission services. So it's quite normal to spend a few years in a particular service and move on. And it's something that's actually positively encouraged. But as I say, we need people who can walk into a room with stakeholders and answer very hard questions. For example, to meet a delegation from the IFA and explain why the Mercosur agreement, including its concessions on beef, are not a bad idea. And I can guarantee you that's not a particularly easy task. So you have to be you have to be resilient, knowledgeable, innovative, see the bigger picture, be a good negotiator, etc. The concours themselves, if you are from an agricultural background and you have the experience, expertise, etc., it's a very good opportunity, because the field is by definition an awful lot narrower than it is for more general specialist concours. But I would advise any interested applicant to speak to, in particular, somebody who has successfully gone through one of these concours. Because if you haven't prepared yourself appropriately, frankly, you won't get through. A lot of this is formalistic. You have to basically go through certain procedures. And the analogy I sometimes make, if you were Einstein, you wouldn't necessarily get through a commission concours, because you might fail on some very elementary thing like filling out your application form correctly. So, speak to the people. But I know, Eamon, the representation is doing a very good job in this context in preparing colleagues to make the necessary investment. And just in conclusion on that, if you do get to a stage where, for example, you're called for an interview or whatever, feel free to give me a call. I sit on a lot of these interview boards. I obviously can't get you through the process itself, but I can give you a lot of advice and heads up on what you can expect or how to prepare yourself. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, not just for setting out the importance of the policy domain and how critical it is to all of our lives, but also for the really practical advice at the end of your presentation as well. That was really, really helpful. And I think it sets us up nicely for the next presentation, which will focus a little bit more on the Irish specific take on some of the policy areas you've been discussing. And there, the presenter is my colleague, Martin Crowley. As I said, Martin leads our agricultural team here at the Permanent Representation. Martin is a former seconded national expert himself, so has worked within the EU institutions and will bring that perspective also to what he has to say to you. So I'm going to hand the floor to you now, Martin, for your piece. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Eamon, and hello to all the audience, if it's an audience or participants. As Michael has already said, we'd have to assume that everybody who's participating in this has a fairly decent background in agriculture policy, and I won't go into history, prehistory almost, to the time when the CAP wasn't a major influence on Ireland, given that it's now 48 years since we've joined the EU, or EEC as it was at the time. And agriculture was seen as one of the main beneficiaries of Ireland's membership in the early days, and that continues to be the case. Clearly, agriculture is no longer quite as large a part of our economy at home, but it's still very, very important in rural areas, and that will continue to be the case in the years to come. When we speak about the CAP in its early years, we spoke mostly in terms of its economic and commercial contribution. But again, as Michael has already spoken to us about, the sustainability agenda is now first and foremost a three-dimensional part of our lives, and our work in the CAP and in agriculture has to take that into account. So all the main changes, as you probably know as agricultural specialists in Ireland agriculture over the last number of years, have come to us via EU policy. Whether it's a single market, whether it's the introduction of milk quotas or the abolition of milk quotas, whether it's the changes in the direct payments regime, all those changes have a very, very substantial impacts on Irish agriculture and will continue to do so. It's very important also, and again, looking at the sustainability aspect and climate action and mitigation, that we consider that while these are EU policies, they aren't policies that are handed to us as a passive entity. They're policies that are developed in the EU policy creation and development and implementation mechanism. And that is driven by the participation of Ireland and other member states and the institutions. And like all other member states, we contribute to that process. And we have to contribute in as actively and imaginative a way as possible. Now, part of that influence comes obviously from our elected representatives, our ministers, our councils, our officials at meetings, our representative groups as lobbyists, and increasingly since the Lisbon Treaty, since co-decision is now relevant to the agriculture sector through our MEPs in the Parliament. But it also comes about the Irish influence through the Irish officials in the Commission. And it's something that I think, as you've obviously seen from Michael, we are very fortunate over the years to have had a very strong representation is probably the wrong word, a strong number of Irish people in DG Agri and acting on agricultural policy. We've been fortunate to have had two agriculture commissioners who were made very substantial and significant contributions to EU policy. We still hear about the McSharry reforms of the mid-90s, which had a very clear reorientation of the policy broadly into more rural development rather than a production orientation which had dominated the CAP previously. But as well as the two commissioners, the hundreds possibly of officials that have had a big impact on the CAP over years have been critical to bringing a sensibility and a sensitivity and an appreciation of Irish agriculture that would be of enormous benefit to not just Ireland, but to agriculture, food producers and food consumers across the EU. And what's really important to note is that all the other parts of the influence process are things we are given as our rights of members, as a member state. The influence we can have as Irish officials, or officials from Ireland, on the CAP and on other policies has to be run by individuals entering into the competition and taking the opportunities to make that contribution, both for your own benefit, and as Michael has said, and I know plenty of people who have benefited greatly from the opportunity to work in such a fabulously diverse and strong organisation that is the Commission. That is a huge benefit to the individuals, but it also gives any applicant and any successful applicant the opportunity to contribute to policies that are of enormous importance, not just here in the EU, but worldwide. And that leadership role that the EU would have, continues to strive to have in working towards sustainability, that starts sometime between now and the 9th of March for you as individuals to take the opportunity to enter that competition and seek to make your mark on things, because you never have a better opportunity than where you're starting from now. So leave it there, Eamon. Thanks.
Thanks, Martin. And again, particularly useful to have an Irish take on the issues that will very much form the subject matter of whoever goes into these roles. We're already getting a number of questions on Slido, and I'll come to those after the next segment. But what I would like to do now is to turn to Pamela Boyle. Pamela is a seconded national expert working in DG Environment. Working in areas that I think are particularly pertinent to the competition, and working in a role that I think is, as I say, similar to the kind of roles being recruited by this competition that we've referred to already several times today. Pamela, I deliberately didn't introduce you in a very long CV manner because I want to conduct this part of the webinar more as a discussion, so that maybe we can get a little bit behind the sort of realities of the role itself. And maybe, Pamela, just to kick us off, you might give us a sense of your own kind of educational background, your professional background, and then we can maybe move into sort of how you got to Brussels. But let's start with that piece.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for inviting me to sit on the panel today. More than happy to talk to you. So for a little bit of background from myself, I actually started with an undergraduate degree in environmental science from the National University of Galway, where my interest in the Common Agricultural Policy and sustainable agriculture was first sparked through our environmental management program, and we touched on sustainability in agriculture, and particularly through the CAP and rural development programs. Following on from that, I completed a master's in University College Cork, where my thesis involved investigating a comparison of grazing systems. And then finally, I committed to farmland from the Institute of Technology in Sligo. And this is very much focused on the identification and quality assessment of high nature value farmland, which was a key indicator under the previous CAP programming period. So following from that, I spent a little bit of time working in private industry and then moved to a position in the Department of Agriculture as an ecologist. So this was an interesting role to play, and reflects the further developments in agriculture in, looking more at the sustainability, not just from an economic and social side, but also from an environmental side.
Thanks. And what was the motivation then for the next jump, the jump to Brussels?
So through all of those experiences, both the educational and in the workplace, I had touched a lot on national policy and the implementation of European policy at a member state level. So I then became very interested in, well, how is this policy actually created and developed? And being fortunate to be within the Department of Agriculture, I was made aware of the opportunity to go on secondment and really see that from the European side of things.
And in terms of your current role then, what is the basic thrust of that?
Yes, so I'm working in the land use and management unit in DG Environment, and specifically on agricultural files. So my main focus within that role is really looking at the development of the next CAP programming period and the implementation of the current CAP programming period through the lens of sustainability for the environment, and also for economics and social side.
And what would you say a typical working day for you looks like?
There's definitely no such thing as one typical day. The workload is really, really varied, really interesting. But just to give some context, on a standard day, you may have a member state meeting in the morning. Before lunch, you'd be working on content for a working group. Then maybe after lunch, you might have a meeting with an NGO, followed by more inputs for an inter-service consultation between DGs. So it's really varied, and communication is a huge part of it. You really get an opportunity to communicate with other DGs, with member states, and with other stakeholders like the NGOs. So it's really varied. There's definitely never a shortage of work and never a dull day.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like an incredibly varied type of job, which is something I think that was echoed by Michael as well in terms of describing the kind of career that people tend to have in the European Commission. And I know that you're there for a more limited period as a seconded national expert, but that thread, I think, runs through both dimensions. What would you say is the most challenging aspect of being in this kind of policy role that you're in?
And the most challenging part would probably be the rate of the work, because the workload is so varied, you really need to be on top of your timing and the work that you're doing, so you don't lose an eye on any of the spinning plates at any one time. But that's also a benefit because it gives you a better experience and more of a feel for what goes on in the Commission, but also the other EU institutions as well. So it's really beneficial from that aspect, even though it can be a challenge.
And the most rewarding side, I suppose, the corollary of that, then, the opposite of that.
So from my perspective, I definitely see the most rewarding side is when you get what I would consider a favourable outcome on a policy decision or a legislative decision. You know, so when we're involved in really big negotiations, and then to find a really positive middle ground that's beneficial for all the stakeholders is the most rewarding aspect of it, for sure.
And in terms of those that are applying for this competition, you know, you've seen the inside of the Commission, you have a sense of what these roles are like day to day. Is there kind of a single piece of advice, if I asked you for one, that you would immediately find coming into your mind? What is that?
I think for me, I would say perseverance, and I'll just explain that a little bit. So for me, this was my third application to a role in the Commission. I first applied for a NEPT position, but as we all know, they're quite competitive, and I was unsuccessful. And then this was the second seconded national expert position that I applied for, and was actually worked out to be more beneficial for me and for the team that I'm working with in the Commission, because it fits my experience and background so well. And then when you do get into one of the European institutions or into a role that you're interested in, perseverance still applies. So, which links back to my comment on the negotiations. So we all come to the table with what we would see as a favourable outcome, but that can be often quite challenging, depending on the perspective of the people on the other side of the table. So to persevere, you're there for a reason, and you have your experience behind you. So, you know, don't be disheartened or frustrated, and just plough on through with it, and you'll get the best outcome for all parties involved.
Thanks, Pamela. That's really helpful, and I think, you know, it does provide people with an insight into the realities of working in the Commission. That's very much a motivation for these webinars that we are currently running. I'm going to move into the Q&A section now, but before I do, just a reminder, it's Slido, sli.do, and EU jobs is the code. If you do want to pose questions, there are already a number of questions I see on the screen. Let me make a stab at answering a couple myself before putting our guests in the hotspot for some of them as well. But let me start with how many posts are likely from this competition. My understanding is that it's around the 55 mark, but I could be wrong about that, and I stand subject to correction by Michael. There's a question about sort of the relevance of language in terms of this concours compared to usual Commission concours. Is the ag experience more important as a consideration? Again, please feel free to chip in, the other guests on this webinar, but my understanding is that the language requirement is still a strict requirement and still important in this context, because of course the Commission does work through various languages, and it's important that people have a capacity in those languages. And that brings me maybe to another question where perhaps Pamela will have a particular insight, but do new entrants seem to find barriers, issues in terms of language? Is language a problem from that perspective? And I suppose it depends what your level is coming in. Maybe Michael, I could go to you just to pick up on any of those that you want to chip in, and then maybe turn to Pamela.
Okay, yeah. Well, in terms of numbers, yes, indeed, it's 55. All the details are set out in the so-called avis de réponse. On the language dimension, again, I think you're correct. The normal language requirements apply. I think basically you obviously have your mother tongue, and then you have to choose a second language, which has to be, if I understand correctly, either English or French to do the major tests. And I'm not going to hide it from you. It's pretty demanding. Most continental Europeans have very strong language skills, and it's no secret that has been somewhat of a barrier to Irish applicants in the recent past. So if you are to position yourself well for getting through this concours, you really will need to ensure that the language in which you submit your tests are up to the required standard. In terms of if and when you arrive in the institution, day to day, frankly, most of the colleagues speak either English or French, probably more English than French at this stage. And as mother tongue English speakers, don't feel that you'll be sitting around being ignored or not being in a position to contribute. Most internal discussion will take place in either of those languages, and as I say, predominantly English, which frankly puts you in a very strong position. Notwithstanding the outstanding linguistic skills of virtually everybody in the Commission, mother tongue people do have that edge, when it comes to very precise writing and skills in particular. They're in a more comfortable position, and that makes them a little bit more, let's say, valuable in terms of, if you're looking at profiles of potential candidates, it's always good to have a mother tongue English and or French people working with you, because, as I say, for certain tasks, you really need, really A1 skills in these particular areas.
Yeah, Pamela, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I mean, for the concours, obviously the language is going to play an even bigger role, but I wouldn't let language put anyone off applying for other ways or streams of becoming getting a position in the Commission. And as Michael said, the majority of the work is done through English, both internally and with other member states or any other stakeholders that you would be involved with. So it shouldn't be something to turn people off entirely.
Thanks, Pamela. There's another question here, which perhaps, Michael, you can cast some light on, but somebody is asking whether a background in food policy would be a suitable background for a competition like this.
Yes, yeah, I think that, in the brief outline I gave you of the types of issues I would expect a DG Agri official to be familiar with, it's food policy, just basically how agriculture impacts on the economy, on trade, on development, on the sustainability dimension. So if I were looking at a CV and somebody came from a food policy direction, I'd be comfortable with it. I stress that we really look for people who have very good, let's say, horizontal vision. I can see the bigger picture, see how agricultural policies fit with these other policy areas, because we live and work in a very complicated world, and all these policies have synergies, and it's really important that you're able to see the links, because if you don't, policy mistakes are made, and those have important consequences. And in our day-to-day work, we have to interact with specialists in all these other areas, in the European Parliament, in the member states, on stakeholder organizations, third countries, international organizations. So you can't break a meeting for a half an hour while you go off and consult with a colleague in another particular area. You really have to have very, very wide-ranging knowledge, and this food policy would be very comfortable with that kind of experience.
Another question where maybe Pamela, you might want to chip in on this one. Somebody's asking about just that, and of course we're in slightly strange times, but that move to Brussels, how are things in terms of accommodation, in terms of other practicalities? Is it an easy place to live in? And I think those of us who've been here would probably answer that in the affirmative, generally speaking, but you may have a bit more you want to say in terms of a relatively recent arrival.
Yeah, I actually arrived 3 weeks before lockdown last year, so I sympathise with anyone considering moving right now, but it actually wasn't that difficult. There is still plenty of accommodation available for anyone that's looking. And actually, in terms of lifestyle, even the fact that we're in a pandemic, things are a little bit more open in Belgium than it is even in Ireland at the moment. So it's still possible to travel within Belgium. It's still possible to really make the most of life here. The museums and everything are open, so you can still experience the culture here. And it's still possible to get to meet people. You know, there's a really thriving Irish community over here. There's a really inclusive GAA club, even when we're not able to train together. And through work and through colleagues, it's definitely easy to settle in and find new friends and get the best of life over here.
Another question, thanks Pamela, that I see is one asking, is Brussels the only location for this competition? I know that there are a lot of related areas in terms of, say, the JRC and other aspects, but Michael, can you cast any light on that in terms of where the likely main thrust of those taken off the competition would be as the location?
Well, DG Agri's headquarters is obviously in Brussels, but I stressed earlier that mobility is actively encouraged in the Commission. And I would, if I asked a potential candidate, where do you see yourself working in 20, 30 years? And they said to me, DG Agri, I'd be frankly a little bit discouraged. We encourage people to move about. And in that context, you know, for example, even DG Agri, we have attaché posts in Washington, in Beijing, in Geneva, in London, and the wider Commission services, a lot of them have a very important international dimension. And to give you yet another more pertinent example, the Commission has its Food and Veterinary Office, or what used to be called the Food and Veterinary Office in Grange, in County Meath, that employs 180 or so functionaries. And because most of its work is in the agri-food area, a lot of those are specialists. So if you really found for one reason or another that you wanted to return to Ireland, you know, given a suitable vacancy, that could be let's say, a route of return while staying employed with the Commission services. But, you know, bottom line, while most jobs are in Brussels, there are opportunities within the Commission services in Brussels themselves, but also opportunities in third countries.
Somebody else asking here, thanks Michael, whether age is an issue, and of course there is no formal age limit as far as I'm aware, so I can confirm that. Then there's another question here asking, is there an intention currently to hire at entry level? And of course, and again, I'll stand corrected perhaps by Michael on this, but there is, I think, a general administrator competition that happens most years, which isn't happening currently because there is a pause as the European Personnel Selection Office and the EU system generally reflects a little bit on its recruitment procedures. And of course, we also have the pandemic this year. So that would be a general entry competition, which, you know, you could find yourself allocated on the list to go to DG Agri from that. But currently there isn't a recruitment competition in that area.
Yeah. Well, EPSO, which is our recruitment office, if you check its website, it gives details of not just individual concours that are currently underway, but the entire recruitment process in general. And yes, as a general rule, the Commission has regular general concours for which anybody can apply from any particular background, but then also specialist competitions. And I mentioned that Agri hadn't had one in literally a generation, but that led to, over time, a depletion of people with real agricultural expertise at recruitment level. So we found ourselves increasingly recruiting from competition lists in other areas, or indeed recruiting specialists from other commission services, be it DG Research, people with a scientific background, DG Scientific with a food policy dimension, etc., etc. But on this occasion, we felt it appropriate to, as I say, have an entirely new competition where we could really seek out people that have qualifications and experience in the agri-related area. But in the fullness of time, the Commission will indeed have further general concours. The data is available, and I think a lot of it is on EPSO. Again, most Commission officials are either from a scientific, legal, or economic background. But there are areas like agriculture also where we do need specialist skills. So it's getting that balance right. But again, I stress, and it's the third time I say it, so it must be getting boring. Once you're in this institution, nobody really cares what your background is. You just prove yourself, and mobility is quite fluid. So you'll find people basically working in all sorts of services that had nothing to do with their original qualifications. And I get back to what I mentioned earlier about having a really multifaceted skill set. You're expected over time to have a good understanding of legal concepts, economic concepts, and just good all-round skills and knowledge.
Thanks, Michael. There's another question here asking about country quotas. Do country quotas apply? And of course they don't, but there is a general obligation on the Commission to try and strike geographic balance in terms of its personnel, so that there is a balance across between countries, and that's something that's reviewed every so often. But in terms of competitions, there isn't a quota system as such. So happy to clarify that. I might take one or two more. The clock is beginning to run against us. I see there's another question which I think has been answered around whether there are open positions in both DG Agri and DG Environment. But I think this recruitment that we're talking about is related to DG Agri alone. Isn't that so, Michael?
Yes, but procedurally, and this happens from time to time, just because you're recruited, or rather succeed in a DG Agri concours, doesn't mean you can't get recruited to another Commission service. Now, we would be quite, let's say, we would regard it as our competition, and that candidates applied for it in the knowledge that it was geared towards agriculture. But there are plenty of precedents for agreeing to allow somebody to be recruited from a competition, in this case, DG Agri, but to another service. So, if you were especially good, or let's say, you could use the DG Agri concours as a route of entry to the Commission, where your real objective is to work in a completely different Commission service. But I would expect that the vast majority of the successful candidates in this competition will end up in DG Agriculture.
Thanks very much. That seems maybe a good point at which to draw to a close. I'm conscious there are many questions that may come in later, and there are already some on the screen. But what we suggest is that you email us at the address that you've already been given, eujobs@dfa.ie, and we'll be happy to either answer ourselves or take up with those who will have the knowledge, the points you make, and come back to you on them. Again, a reminder, the deadline for the specific competition that's been referenced so often during the course of the last 50 minutes or so is the 9th of March. And that's an important deadline to bear in mind. Again, clarity around the application process, precision around the application process, really hugely important. I think, there are good opportunities for Irish people in this competition. If you don't make it on this occasion, do look at other routes into the Commission, and do consider other routes into the Commission, including, for example, roles as temporary contractors, which can be a great starting point as well for getting into the institutions. In terms of further assistance from us, can I ask that maybe you consider following us on Twitter? That's @EUJobsIreland, and also on our YouTube account, as I've already mentioned. I think I'd like to pay one last big thank you to our three guests today. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you to my colleagues at the Permanent Representation, especially Aphrodite Passata, for helping to put this together. And I'll leave it there by wishing you the very best of luck with the current competition. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Good luck to you all. Bye.